Sorry about that. Hey everyone, welcome to the second lesson in the coal mining sequence. So what we're going to move on to looking at today is how when you dig either a deep mine or an open cast mine, how that affects the environment in negative ways and what can be done to repair the damage. So can you pause the video here for a moment and copy down this title in your books and we'll get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at an image of an area that has been mined and identify some of the ways that the environment may have been impacted. What we're then going to do is draw a graph using some data to analyse whether or not mining really is having that much of an impact on the environment or not by looking at animal population numbers. And then we're going to look at how the damage to the environment could be repaired. So you have this photo in your handout. Cut it out and stick it down with about half a page worth of space to create a spider diagram around it. If you're not able to print it out and stick it down, don't worry. Just create a bubble with the title, What Problems Do Mines Leave Behind When They Close? Okay, so set that up, and then let's have a look at this image and see what impacts the mine might have had on the surrounding environment. Okay, so this mine has actually more or less closed in this image. It's quite hard to tell, but you can see that there's just lingering what we call smog, air pollution, smoky fog in the area from all of the furnace air pollution produced when the mine was working. This down here in this corner is the waste heap. There will be several tons of this stuff all over the valley sides, and it's full of toxins and dust and old rock and bits of coal. You've got all the metalwork and old machinery and things left lying around as well. And of course this would have been habitats originally. It would have been an untouched forest or grassed area that was home to lots of animal species. So you've got residual leftover air pollution, broken down old buildings and machinery, complete habitat destruction in the area, the waste heap full of toxins that when it rains, those toxins are washed into the rivers and it contaminates the water supply. So pause the video here a moment and create a spider diagram for the problems that mines leave behind when they close. Okay, so let's look at just how much of an effect some of these things have on the area. So if we're talking about contaminated water, animals are going to be drinking it. Habitat destruction, there's nowhere for animals to live. Let's actually create a graph that shows how animal populations have changed over time in an area where mining has happened. So the first thing we're going to do before we draw a graph, though, is identify what makes a good graph. Now this is a climate graph. It's a completely different kind of graph to the one that we're going to draw, but what is wrong with it? Take a good look and then we'll make a list. Okay, so some of the things that you might have spotted. There's no main title here. There's no axes label down here. It's got temperature degrees C here, but then precipitation, which is the proper word for rainfall, there's no units. This side goes 20, 40, 60, 80 in equal spacing. This side goes 2, 4, so it starts going up in 2s, then it jumps in a 4, and another 4, and then a 1. So these axes numbers are no good. It should be equally spaced. They haven't used a ruler, and they haven't used a pencil. That's a pen line. So when we're drawing a graph, we need to make sure that we use a pencil and a ruler. If it's named or word data, that's called categoric. So if it's how many cats, dogs, rabbits and parrots each of us owns and we did a survey, that's named data. And that means that you have to draw bars. It's called categoric data. The bars should be the same width as the other bars. And these bars shouldn't be touching either. They should have gaps between them, between the categories, and all the gaps should be the same width as the other gaps. They shouldn't touch each other or the y-axes, the side axes. Your axes have to be labelled and have units if needed. The graph must have a main title. You need a key if it's needed, and the axis spacing should be even. You don't have to write this down. If you want to pause the video here and do so, you can, but you don't have to, because we're going to refer back to this after we've drawn our graph and use it as like a tick list to see how good our graph is. So, let's draw a graph for this data. What kind of data is this? you've got a row of numbers for the number of foxes, sparrows, for the number of each type of animal living in an area in 1911. And you've got a row of numbers for the number of each animal living in the same area in 2011. So this data is 100 years apart, and the information is in hundreds. So, for example, in 1911 there were 500 foxes living in the area. By the year 2011, there were only 100 foxes living in the area. Okay, this data has been taken from an area in southeastern Wales, in the sort of Merthyr Valleys, that kind of area there. So definitely a really mining-rich area. What kind of graph would you draw for this? Have we got any categoric data, any named data? Is our data in categories? Yeah, okay, we've got names up here. And there's nothing in between these. You don't get something that's half sparrow and half fox. Okay, so they are distinct categories from one another. There's nothing in between. If it was temperature, between 1 degree C and 2 degrees C, you have 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. That's called continuous. There's something in between. With this named data, there's nothing in between. So it's categoric data, so we're going to draw bars, and because there's nothing in between, we're going to leave gaps between our bars. Now then, because we're not in school together and graphs can sometimes be a little bit tricky, I've given you the layout here. Now, if you've got graph paper at home, great. Otherwise, you'll be okay to draw it on the lines in your book, but I suggest you take plenty of space. If you're working in the smaller A5 books, you're going to want to take a whole page. If you're working in the larger A4 books, half a page should be plenty. So on the y-axis, we've got the population, the number of each type of animal in hundreds. There should be a 0 here. Okay. And then we've got our categories down here, our named data. All right? We've got a full graph title and we've got a key, and I'm going to show you why we need that in a minute. So we want to compare the changes over time in the number of the population of each type of animal in this area that has been experiencing mining over the last 100 years. So we're going to draw a bar for the number of animals before the mine opened and a bar for the number of animals after the mine closed. And it's a 100-year difference between them. So for foxes, for example, excuse me, 500 foxes living in the Rhondda Valley in 1911, 100 foxes left living there by 2011. So the way that we would draw our bars, there is our space for foxes. We would draw in that space a bar that's 5 high for pre-mine opening and a bar that's only 1 high for after the mine opened. And this is what that would look like. Okay, so when you're then going to do it for sparrows, there were 700 sparrows in the area in 1911 and just 300 in the area in 2011. So I would take a dark blue and draw a 700 high bar, and then I'd take a light blue and draw a however many high bar because I've forgotten. The important thing, look, the spaces are the same width as the other spaces and the bars are the same width as the other bars. So within your space for sparrows, space, bar for 1911, space, bar for 2011, space. Okay, so step 1, with a pencil and a ruler, draw your graph. Step 2, make sure you put in a key. You can use any 2 colours you like. Step 3, if you want to do some extension, describe what has happened to the wildlife overall. Now, when you describe a graph, you literally say what you see and you quote figures. So you're going to talk about the changes in the number of each type of animal and then maybe explain a little bit why you think this has happened. So draw out your axes, plot on your bars, colour your bars, describe and explain your graph. Pause the video here a moment and give that a go, please. Okay, what you will have seen, I haven't plotted out all the bars as an example graph, but what you will have seen is the population of every single animal has declined. It has decreased over the 100 years. And this is probably because of the things we looked at in our first black and white photo. There's no habitats for them to live in anymore, so they've had to leave the area. The water supply is contaminated, which might have poisoned some of them. There's a lot of air pollution and a lot of waste material around and dangerous machinery, and there's no habitats for them to live in. So how can we fix this? Because as we know, there are mining sites all over Wales, all over Britain even, but particularly in Wales, that are having this effect on wildlife. Make sure before we move on that you've done your graph checks. All right. So in fact, we need an axes label down here. This should say animals. So make sure you've written the main title. You've got gaps between your bars. It doesn't touch the side axes. The units are equally spaced. The axes are labelled. You've got a key. All right, do your checks a minute. Make sure that graph is 100% accurate before we move on. All right, so let's look at how the damage can be repaired. What I'd like you to do is have a little look at this link. So if I just end the show for a moment, you can copy and paste this from the PowerPoint yourself to have a look. I've got a horrible feeling actually that this might not work anymore. Paste. Oh no, might do. Okay, let's take a little look. So what they've done here, if you read this article, is they've taken an old mining site. So you can see some of the old machinery is here. And they have afforested. They have planted plants and trees and vegetation. You can see here the old coal tip, the old mining area, how bad it was before they started to tidy it up a little bit. So have a little read of this article by copying and pasting the link into the browser, like I just showed you, but read it in your own time. Okay, so let's explore this idea a little bit further. You've got this photo in your handout, so if you're able to print it and cut and stick it, great. It's going to form the middle of a spider diagram. But if you're not able to print it and cut and stick it, just use this subheading as the centre of your spider diagram. What can be done to restore the areas that are so damaged by coal mining? So let's take a little look and create a spider diagram together. Believe it or not, you can see the valley in the background here. This area here looked a lot like the black and white picture from the start of this lesson. And they've put a lot of money and time and investment into fixing it, into restoring it. When a mine closes, it affects the environment and it affects people. There's lots of job losses, so there's not much money left for people and there's not much money in the economy. And there's habitat loss and dirt and contamination and pollution. So what they've done here is built some things that will help people and provide jobs and bring money to the economy, whilst also creating places for animals to live again. So they've put a small visitor centre here, and that will attract people to the area. It's nice for walking, it's nice for picnics, and they might spend money. Maybe there's a little cafe in here, and that will boost the local economy. In some cases, what they do with an old mine is they turn it into a museum, like Big Pit. And again, that attracts a lot of tourists, and that boosts the economy in the area and provides jobs for ex-miners that otherwise wouldn't be able to earn money to support their family anymore. They've also cleaned up the area. There's not a waste heap in sight now, and that means the water supply is not contaminated anymore, so it's clean drinking water, not only for wildlife, but for local villages as well. Afforestation. Deforestation is removing trees and plants. Afforestation is putting them back. You replant them. So it's created new habitats to bring wildlife back into the area. And what they've actually done with a lot of the waste heap that was here is repurposed it. They use it to make tarmac in the area, or sometimes the more solid waste, you can actually sort of, using pressure, clump it together to create sculptures to honour the history of the area. And what they've done, the open cast blasted area, they've actually flooded it to create a boating or fishing lake, and that will attract tourists and locals that again will spend money in the area, and it'll boost the economy again. So this regeneration not only helps the environment, it helps local people and the economy as well. So pause the video here a moment and make a little spider diagram just like this in your books, please. Okay, so the closing thing that I'd like you to do from this lesson is a research task to set up for next lesson. There's a coal mine not far from us, actually, called Tower Colliery. Now, the word colliery is just another word for a coal mine, okay? Now, Tower Colliery has quite a famous history behind it. In the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, Britain's first female Prime Minister, there was a lot of unrest because around that time the government was trying to close all of the coal mines across South Wales because they believed that they were not economically viable anymore. They weren't making money. They were losing the country money, and so she tried to close all the coal mines, but that would have put thousands, hundreds of thousands of people out of work. So there were lots of miners' strikes and things going on at the time that you might have heard about. Now, Tower Colliery was shut. It was closed by the government at the time, and lots of miners lost their job, and they were given redundancy pay. Now, redundancy it's a little bit different to being sacked. If you're made redundant, you've been put out of a job and it's not your fault. If you're sacked, then you've been put out of your job because it's your fault usually. But being made redundant, what happens is maybe the business you work for has closed and it wasn't your fault, so you get a little bit of redundancy pay. And that tides you over until you find a new job. That's the idea with it. But the miners from Tower Colliery decided to do something else with their redundancy pay. They didn't want to go off and find other jobs. They used that redundancy pay for something else. So what I'd like you to do is get on the internet and do some research on Tower Colliery. What is it? Where is it? Give me some photos and a map and a description. Some times and dates. When did it first open? How many people worked there? You might find a little bit about a small explosion that happened and killed a few of the miners. And when did it first close and why? It reopened. Spoilers, okay? But how and why and when did it reopen? And then when was it forced to finally close? And what are the future plans for the site? And if there's any other information you find out along the way, feel free to include that as well. Either typed up and printed out, or handwritten notes in the front of your book, a one-page information sheet all about Tower Colliery. You're going to use this information to write a newspaper report as if you are a news reporter there on the day that Tower Colliery finally closed, right at the end. And you've been speaking to the miners and finding all about what's so interesting about Tower Colliery's history. Okay, so the more information you find out here, the more interesting and easy to write your newspaper article is going to be next lesson. If you have any questions, drop me an email, gleasona@hubcymru.net. Otherwise, I'll see you next lesson.